I want to start tonight with a moment that many people brushed off as just another one of those political outbursts that pass through the news cycle like weather. A headline flashes across your phone. You glance at it, maybe shrug, and tell yourself it probably won't affect your life by the time you're making breakfast tomorrow. But then something subtle happens. Something quieter than a press conference, but far more consequential. You look at a map differently. You cancel a trip you used to make every summer. You decide not to buy the product you always bought without a second thought. And suddenly, an offhand remark by a political figure becomes a slow burn economic fracture between two countries that have spent generations telling themselves they were partners, neighbors, even friends. That is the real story behind what you heard about Donald Trump's attack on Canada and Canada's very human, very economic response. Most people saw the headline. Very few understood how deeply the ripple actually goes. Because when Trump imposed those steep tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and alcohol, people assumed this was the usual playbook of economic nationalism. But the real inflection point wasn't the policy, it was the posture. When he publicly referred to Canada as the 51st state and dismissed an entire sovereign country as something like an annex of American territory, that remark hit a national nerve. You may have heard it and thought it was just bravado or bluster, the kind of language you tune out by now. But for millions of Canadians who grew up believing that cross-border respect was a given, that the relationship was built on mutual recognition, that comment landed like a door slamming shut. And once pride enters an economic equation, the math changes. Now officially, what happened was simple. A US administration decided to place tariffs ranging from roughly a quarter to half the value of some major Canadian exports. That alone would have created tension. Tariffs always redistribute pain. They hit specific workers, specific firms, specific communities first. But when you add the rhetoric, the insult, the sense that a neighbor was suddenly a bully, the debate shifted from policy to identity. You saw people all across Canada asking themselves a basic question. Why are we spending money in a country that treats us like this? And once that question starts circulating, it doesn't stay abstract for long. It becomes a personal decision at the cash register, at the gas station, at the border crossing. To understand how quickly this escalated, we need to look at the context most people never talk about. For decades, Canadians have been a lifeline for countless American border towns. If you live in one of those communities, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe your job depends on weekend traffic. Maybe your town's big shopping plaza sees more Ontario plates than local ones. When those visitors stop coming, even for a month, the difference isn't a rounding error. It's the difference between keeping your hours at work and losing your shifts entirely. And millions of Canadians make those trips not out of luxury, but routine. They go for groceries, for gas, for school supplies, for dentist appointments, for vacations. It is one of the most underappreciated cross-border flows in North America, and it evaporated almost overnight once people felt disrespected. You might be thinking right now, can something as simple as sentiment really shift an entire consumer pattern? And the answer, if you follow economics closely, is absolutely yes. Markets are not machines. They are human systems built out of trust, reciprocity, habit, and a sense of fairness. When people feel that a relationship is unbalanced, they move their dollars accordingly. And that is exactly what Canadians did. They didn't wait for a policy directive or a parliamentary debate. They responded through their wallets. They redirected vacations to domestic destinations. They chose European trips instead of American ones. They picked Canadian goods over American brands. And although each individual choice seems small, Millions of small choices work like a tide pulling away from shore. By the time anyone notices, the waterline has already moved. But here's the part of the story that rarely makes the headlines. This wasn't just an emotional reaction, it was a rational one. When you grow up next to a country 10 times your size, you learn to read signals. You learn to understand how vulnerable your economy can be when a more powerful neighbor suddenly starts treating you as insignificant. You learn to defend your domestic industries not just through tariffs or regulations, but through cultural loyalty. So when Canadians heard that language about being a 51st state, they recognized the threat behind the tone. Not a military threat, not a diplomatic threat, but a threat to dignity, autonomy, and economic self-determination. And that is what transformed a tariff dispute into a nationwide boycott that the United States genuinely did not expect. And while all of this was happening, local businesses on the American side were watching something frightening unfold. Parking lots that used to be full every Saturday now stood half empty. Gas stations that used to depend on cross-border commuters were suddenly quiet. Outlet malls, restaurants, motels, all of them felt the absence. Because for border economies, Canadian spending isn't a bonus. It is structural. It is baked into revenue forecasts, hiring decisions, rent payments, and loan obligations. When a third of your visitors stop showing up, the numbers stop working. And as those numbers stopped working, you began to see something important about how interconnected these two economies really are. People like to imagine that national economies are separate spheres, that each one lives behind a border with its own logic and its own destiny. But if you stand in a shop in Buffalo, or a motel in Bellingham, or a mall in Plattsburgh, you can see immediately that this idea is fiction. The prosperity of those places has always depended on a quiet, steady stream of Canadian families crossing a line on a map to spend money. And when that stream dries up, the invisible architecture that supports entire communities starts to show its cracks. Workers lose hours, managers cut staff, small businesses struggle to cover rent, and the whole town feels the contraction long before any official data comes out. This is what economists mean when they talk about interdependence, but for the people living it, it feels much more personal. What makes this moment even more revealing is that the Canadian government did not respond with the kind of retaliation many people expected. You didn't see an explosion of counter tariffs or dramatic speeches about punishing the United States. Instead, you saw something far more deliberate and arguably far more effective. You saw leaders urging people to support local businesses, to prioritize domestic supply chains, to invest in their own communities. Buy Canadian. Campaigns surged, not as forced patriotism, but as a calm reminder that a strong national economy depends on choosing to keep wealth circulating at home. And this wasn't some heavy-handed nationalistic project. It was simply an affirmation that if a partner devalues you, you have every right to reinforce your own foundation. What's fascinating, if you look at it through the lens of economic structure, is how these campaigns worked, because the moment had already primed people for them. When Canadians were insulted publicly, they didn't need much convincing to buy local. It felt natural, almost instinctive. And once people shift their habits for emotional reasons, it often evolves into a rational pattern. A family buys Canadian products one week because they feel slighted by the United States. The next week, they do it because they discover the quality is good. A month later, they do it without thinking at all. Economic behavior becomes culture, and culture becomes structure. And structure reshapes markets far more powerfully than any angry speech ever could. Meanwhile, the social fabric between the two countries was beginning to fray in ways that are harder to measure, but just as consequential. You started hearing people talk about canceling traditions that had lasted years, even generations. Annual trips to American coasts and theme parks and hiking trails were quietly dropped. Some families even sold their long-held vacation homes in northeastern states because they no longer felt welcome. And for anyone who has studied economic geography, that is a massive warning sign. Once people disinvest emotionally, physical disinvestment often follows. When the emotional bridge collapses, the economic bridge rarely stays standing for long. What's striking about this entire situation is how economic decisions and human feelings are threaded together. People often imagine economics as purely numbers, spreadsheets, charts, and forecasts. But this moment shows you something different. It shows you what happens when dignity becomes a variable in the equation. When people feel disrespected, they don't just post about it on social media. They reorient their spending, their travel, their sense of belonging. And because consumer economies rely on predictable habits, any large-scale disruption caused by sentiment becomes a structural shock. If you're watching this from the United States, you might be wondering why this matters to you personally. And the answer is that it reveals how fragile your local economy might be without you realizing it. Even if you've never lived in a border town, even if you've never interacted with Canadian tourists, these ripple effects highlight a deeper truth about the American economy. So much of it is built on relationships rather than guarantees. The jobs you depend on, the businesses you rely on, the stability you take for granted, all emerge from networks of trust. And when those networks break down, economic pain doesn't always hit the places you expect. The damage often shows up in the most vulnerable communities first. Workers paid hourly, small businesses with thin margins, local governments dependent on sales tax revenue that no longer arrives. And here's where the incentive structure becomes impossible to ignore. Political leaders can make statements that raise their personal profile or energize a certain base of supporters. But the economic cost of those statements doesn't land on them personally. It lands on workers who had nothing to do with the decision. A president may insult a neighboring country and move on by lunchtime, but a server at a restaurant near the border loses half their tips for the month. A steel worker, thousands of miles away from Washington, sees their job threatened because a retaliatory market shift ripples back into their industry. These are the asymmetries built into the system. And they're the reason why, if you want to understand the real consequences of political rhetoric, you have to follow the money all the way down to the people who never signed up for the fight. At the same time, Canadians themselves were navigating a new set of anxieties. Many expressed real fear about how they would be treated if they crossed into the United States during a moment of heightened tension. Even if you or I might not share that fear, the fact that so many Canadians felt it tells us something about how quickly national sentiment can change. When people begin to worry about hostility from a neighbor they once trusted, you know that the social foundation of the relationship has eroded far more than politicians anticipated. And once again, that erosion expresses itself economically before it shows up anywhere else. People stay home. People spend differently. People redirect their loyalty. And this is where we start to see the deeper mechanics behind everything that unfolded. When a political figure frames a neighboring country as subordinate, even symbolically, it alters the power dynamics that people have quietly accepted for decades. Canada has always lived in the shadow of a much larger economic and political force. Many Canadians understand consciously or not, that the United States wields an outsized influence over their markets, their media, their trade routes, their currency stability. When that imbalance is treated respectfully, it feels manageable. But when that imbalance is flaunted, mocked, or twisted into a taunt, it triggers a defensive response rooted in both economic prudence and cultural preservation. That's why the shift in consumer behavior was so swift. People were not only rejecting American goods, they were reclaiming a sense of agency. As these choices compounded, you began to see what economists call cumulative causation, where one small shift triggers another, and then another, until the entire system starts moving in a new direction. A family in Manitoba skips their trip to North Dakota. A couple in British Columbia avoids crossing into Washington. A group of friends in Quebec pick a local restaurant over a chain headquartered in the United States. Each action seems small in isolation, but together they form a pattern. And once a pattern forms, it influences expectations. Businesses start forecasting lower revenue. Workers expect fewer shifts. Governments anticipate lower tax receipts. Expectations guide behavior, and behavior reinforces expectations. Before long, you have an economic loop that sustains itself. Meanwhile, on the American side, very few policymakers seemed to grasp the severity of what was occurring. They saw tariffs as a bargaining chip and rhetoric as a political tool. What they failed to understand was that these tools were being applied not to a faceless foreign power, but to a country deeply intertwined with everyday American life. The tens of thousands of Canadian visitors who fuel border economies are not abstract variables in a model. They are the people who keep weekend commerce alive. They are the ones who make restaurant patios full in July and hotel lobbies busy in August. When they step back, the rhythm of those towns changes. If you live in one of those places, you might have felt the silence before anyone in Washington did. And while the United States aimed to project strength, Canada projected something else entirely: discipline. Instead of matching aggression with aggression, leaders chose to strengthen internal resilience. They encouraged local industries, promoted regional agriculture, highlighted domestic craftsmanship, and reminded people that economic sovereignty is not built through retaliation, but through cultivation. The Buy Manitoba, Buy Canadian initiatives were not parades of nationalism. They were pragmatic responses to a moment of insult. And the effect was real. Local producers reported noticeable spikes in demand. Farmers saw more direct support. Small manufacturers saw consumers rediscovering their products. What began as a symbolic protest hardened into a genuine economic reorientation. All of this would matter less if it didn't signal something larger about the state of global relationships today. We're living in a world where alliances that once seemed indestructible are thinning under the weight of performative politics. Leaders use provocative language to rally attention without considering the economic fragility underneath. And that fragility becomes most visible in cross-border relationships where people, goods, and capital flow freely until they don't. Canada and the United States represent one of the most peaceful, integrated borders on the planet. When tension slips into that environment, it exposes vulnerabilities that were always there, just hidden beneath decades of habit. For ordinary Canadians, the decision to stay home wasn't just about punishing the United States. It was about safety, comfort, and emotional certainty. When someone wonders whether they might face hostility for simply using their passport, that is no longer an economic decision. That is a psychological one, and psychological shifts have long tails. People rarely return to old habits immediately after a political controversy cools down. They adopt new routines, new vacation spots, new brands, and those routines shape future generations as well. A child who grows up vacationing in Nova Scotia instead of Maine, or flying to France instead of Florida, inherits a different sense of what is normal. That is how culture shifts, slowly and quietly. This moment also forced many Americans to confront something uncomfortable: that their country's political theatrics can create real consequences for people who never intended to participate in them. An entire hospitality workforce in border regions found themselves economically exposed because a political leader decided to score rhetorical points. And while some people may dismiss this as collateral damage or temporary turbulence, those workers don't experience it as temporary. When you lose income, when your hours shrink, when your workplace closes early, those impacts stay with you. They shape your ability to pay rent, to save money, to plan for the future. They reveal how vulnerable you are to decisions made far above your head. But perhaps the most important part of this story is what it reveals about power. In a world where the United States has long assumed that its size gives it leverage over its neighbors, this moment showed something different. It showed that smaller countries can still influence outcomes through collective behavior. Canada didn't need to flex militarily or politically. It didn't need to stage dramatic gestures. It simply needed millions of ordinary people to make ordinary decisions that collectively carried extraordinary weight. That is the kind of power that cannot be controlled through tariffs or threats. It is the power of consumers, citizens, and communities who understand that dignity is not a luxury. It is a fundamental component of economic life. As this dynamic unfolded, you could see the tension between two competing visions of how economies work. One vision imagines that power is centralized in political offices, corporate headquarters, and capital markets. It assumes that leaders make decisions and everyone else simply reacts. The other vision, the one that came to life in this moment, is the quieter truth economists often forget to emphasize. It's the truth that ordinary people, through millions of individual choices, shape the direction of entire industries. You saw that in the way Canadians shifted their vacations, their purchases, and their routines. You saw that in how American border towns suddenly felt a pressure they did not prepare for. And you saw that in the realization that no political speech, no matter how forceful, can reliably dictate human behavior when people feel their respect has been violated. At the same time, this situation revealed how heavily border communities depend on predictable cross-national flows. People who don't live near the border often assume that the American economy is enormous and diverse enough to absorb shocks without much difficulty. But the truth is that certain regions hinge disproportionately on foreign spending. A town near the Great Lakes, a small city in upstate New York, a shopping district in Washington state. These places are not insulated. They are vulnerable precisely because their economies were built on the assumption that Canadians will always come, will always spend, will always treat these trips as part of normal life. When those assumptions break, the fragility becomes visible. Businesses that seemed stable a year earlier suddenly struggle. Workers who expected steady hours find themselves competing for reduced shifts. And local governments, which rely heavily on sales tax revenue, start facing budget shortfalls that force them to cut services. What makes this especially striking is how little political leaders seem to engage with these downstream realities. Tariffs are often presented as tools of national strength, but they operate like hammers in a world that mostly requires careful instruments. They create retaliation, distortion, substitution, and uncertainty. And uncertainty is the most dangerous part. When consumers don't know what comes next, they hold back. When businesses fear instability, they reduce investment. When workers feel exposed, they change their plans. In this case, the uncertainty driven by rhetoric and policy collided with a deep emotional shift, producing an outcome that neither side officially declared, but millions of people enacted nonetheless.